Ethan Carter rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion as his Honda Civic rolled down the empty road. It was almost 10 p.m., and after a long day buried in lines of code and software bugs, all he wanted was to get home, collapse onto his couch, and zone out to whatever reality show was on. Outside, the city seemed to be asleep. The streetlights cast a dim, yellowish glow, stretching eerie shadows across the deserted sidewalks. There wasn't another car in sight, just the quiet hum of his engine and the cold November wind brushing against his windshield. Suddenly, in his rearview mirror, 2 headlights appeared. A car was tailing him. Ethan frowned. Who else was out this late? Before he could think too much about it, flashing red and blue lights lit up the night. Police. His heart pounded. Had he done something wrong? A quick glance at his speedometer, 42 miles per hour in a 45 zone. No stop signs, no red lights. That didn't make sense. But the lights behind him kept flashing. His throat went dry as he pulled over, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Outside, the silence felt suffocating. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car, one built like a football linebacker, the other with eyes sharp as a razor. Ethan swallowed hard as their heavy footsteps echoed against the pavement. A regular night had just turned into a nightmare. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as the tall officer stepped up to his window. The beam of a flashlight hit his eyes, blindingly bright, forcing him to squint. "Evening, sir." "License and registration," the officer ordered, his voice as sharp as a blade. The name on his badge read, Lieutenant Derek Vaughn. Not wanting trouble, Ethan quickly grabbed his wallet, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out his driver's license and registration. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but something about this whole situation felt off. "Did I do something wrong, officer?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone polite. Vaughn didn't answer right away. He glanced at Ethan's documents, then looked up, a faint, unreadable smirk playing on his lips. Just a routine stop. Ethan's gut told him otherwise. As Vaughn stood there, the second officer, Officer Jake Holloway, built like a football linebacker, was already circling the car like a predator stalking its prey. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "Sir, would you mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Vaughn's tone left no room for argument. Ethan hesitated for a second, but refusing would only make things worse. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. Holloway didn't waste time. He marched straight to the back of the car and, before Ethan could say a word, flipped open the trunk. No permission. No warrant. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Wait, what are you doing?" But Holloway ignored him. He bent down, inspecting something inside, then suddenly stopped. A slow, amused chuckle escaped his lips. Well, what do we have here?" Ethan frowned, stepping forward. A black duffel bag sat in his trunk. He blinked, his mind struggling to process what he was looking at. He hadn't put anything in there. This didn't make sense. Holloway yanked the zipper open, and what Ethan saw made his blood turn to ice. Stacks of $100 bills, neatly packed. Next to it, an old handgun, its grip worn down like it had passed through too many hands. Ethan felt the world tilt. "That's not mine." His voice came out dry, almost cracking. Vaughn's smirk deepened. "Then why is it in your trunk?" Ethan shook his head, his breathing uneven. This was a setup. They had planted it. His throat tightened as Vaughn patted his shoulder, like a hunter pleased with his catch. "Turn around," Vaughn ordered. Before Ethan could react, rough hands shoved him forward. Cold metal snapped around his wrists, handcuffs. "Wait, you're making a mistake. That's not mine." Ethan struggled, but Holloway only laughed. "Yeah, that's what they all say." The squad car waited, its flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Ethan was shoved into the back seat. The air inside reeked of stale cigarettes, sweat, and bad decisions. Outside, Vaughn and Holloway stood there, sharing a smug glance, like they had just won an easy bet. Ethan leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes, trying to breathe. Tonight, he had walked into a trap. And the worst part? No one knew he needed saving. Ethan sat frozen on the cold metal chair, his hands cuffed in front of him. The room was small, bare, with nothing but a battered old table. The flickering fluorescent light cast eerie shadows on the walls. No windows. No clock. Just four walls closing in, making time feel meaningless. The door creaked open. Lieutenant Vaughn stepped in, followed closely by Officer Holloway, who still wore that smug half-smirk. Vaughn pulled out a chair and sat across from Ethan, while Holloway leaned against the wall, arms crossed, like he was just waiting for Ethan to slip up. Vaughn placed a thick folder on the table, flipping it open with agonizing slowness, deliberately stretching out the tension. "Ethan Cole," he said, his voice low and measured. 32 years old. Works in finance. Clean record. Until tonight. He looked up, narrowing his eyes like he was sizing Ethan up. "So tell me, Ethan, how does a guy like you end up with a trunk full of stolen cash and an unregistered firearm?" Ethan clenched his jaw, his heart pounding against his ribs. "I told you. That's not mine." Holloway chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, you can do better than that." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "You didn't even have a warrant. You searched my car illegally. And now you're trying to pin this on me?" He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Vaughn. "Tell me, how long have you two been doing this?" Vaughn didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "That's an interesting theory. But see, we don't need a warrant when we have probable cause. And right now, all the evidence points to you." He slid a photo across the table. It was a shot of the duffel bag in Ethan's trunk, stacks of cash and the gun gleaming under a flashlight beam. "Your fingerprints are all over the gun," Vaughn continued, his voice calm but laced with menace. "And security footage places your car near the bank that got hit earlier tonight." Ethan felt his blood run cold. "That's impossible." Holloway clicked his tongue and nodded. "Yeah, they all say that too." Ethan studied the two men in front of him. This wasn't a mistake. This was a setup. A calculated, well-executed trap. He didn't know why they had chosen him, but one thing was clear: they wanted to break him. Vaughn sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "Listen, Ethan. If you just confess now, things will go a lot smoother for you." Ethan's fists tightened. "I'm not confessing to something I didn't do." The room fell silent. Holloway straightened up, cracking his knuckles. "Then I guess we're doing this the hard way." Ethan swallowed hard. He needed to find a way out of this, before it was too late. Ethan sat slumped against the rough concrete wall of his cold, dimly lit cell. Last night, after hours of relentless interrogation, he had been thrown in here without so much as an explanation beyond the fabricated charges hanging over him. No food, no water, just the flickering overhead light and the occasional sighs of other detainees. No one cared whether he was guilty or not. To Vaughn and Holloway, he was just another pawn, someone they could sacrifice to cover up their own dirty work. But Ethan wasn't the type to break easily. He knew he had to find a way to turn the tables. The next morning, the heavy clank of the cell door jolted him from his thoughts. A guard yanked him to his feet and shoved him into the hallway. "Your lawyer's waiting," the officer grunted. Ethan narrowed his eyes. A lawyer? That meant someone out there was fighting for him. As he stepped into the interrogation room, he saw a man in a dark suit, his hair slightly disheveled, but his sharp eyes radiated confidence and determination. "Ethan Cole?" the man asked in a steady, measured tone. "I'm Daniel Pierce, your attorney." Ethan sat down, skepticism evident in his gaze. "Who hired you?" Pierce smirked slightly. "Someone who believes you're innocent?" Ethan's jaw tightened. No one knew about his situation except the people who had orchestrated it. He gritted his teeth. "So, do you have a way to prove it?" Pierce didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a USB drive, placing it on the table. "I have this," he said, tapping the drive with his finger. "Traffic camera footage near the spot where you were pulled over. It clearly shows Officer Holloway placing the bag in your trunk." Ethan's pulse quickened. This was it. This was his chance to expose the truth. "Then what are we waiting for?" he pressed. "Let's take it to court." Pierce exhaled slowly, his expression turning serious. "It's not that simple. I need time to make sure this evidence gets admitted without being dismissed." He hesitated briefly before continuing. "And there's a bigger issue. These two cops aren't acting alone. I have reason to believe they're part of a larger corruption ring inside the department. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. If Pierce was right, this wasn't just about a setup. This was an organized, well-oiled operation, and he had unknowingly become its latest victim. He clenched his fists, determination burning in his eyes. So what do we do? Pierce studied him for a moment, then nodded. We expose them, but you need to stay calm and follow my lead. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. If Vaughn and Holloway thought they could destroy his life that easily, they had picked the wrong man. The contradict. Ethan adjusted his collar, trying to maintain his composure as he stepped into the courtroom. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with hushed whispers, and the bright fluorescent lights overhead only intensified the tension. At the prosecution's table, Vaughn and Holloway sat with smug expressions, certain they had already won. Ethan clenched his fists, taking a deep breath. They weren't going to win. Pierce rose from his seat, his sharp gaze cutting through the room. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice steady but powerful. The prosecution's key witnesses are the very officers who arrested my client. But today, we will prove that they are not the protectors of justice they claim to be. All eyes were on Pierce as he moved to the center of the room. We have footage from a traffic camera, capturing a crucial moment in this case. He turned to the judge. With your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to present this evidence. The judge nodded. The large screen flickered on. The video played slowly, showing the moment Ethan's car was pulled over. But then, the critical detail, Holloway was clearly seen placing the bag into the trunk himself. The courtroom erupted in gasps. A few jury members exchanged shocked glances. Vaughn shot to his feet, his voice shaking. That footage could be doctored. Pierce folded his arms, his expression unreadable. Then let's have a forensic expert verify it. He paused for effect. But let me guess, you wouldn't want that, would you? Silence. Ethan could see the sweat forming on Vaughn's brow. The prosecutor scrambled to regain control. That does not prove the defendant wasn't involved in the robbery. Pierce smirked. Doesn't it? He pulled out a thick file, flipped to a page, and slammed it onto the table. My client has an ironclad alibi. Office security footage shows he was at work the entire time the robbery took place. Another wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Ethan glanced at the jury, noticing a few of them nodding in understanding. The tide was turning. The judge leaned forward. Prosecution, do you have a rebuttal? A long silence followed. Vaughn and Holloway exchanged desperate looks, their faces turning pale. Finally, the judge turned to the jury. Does the jury have a verdict? A middle-aged man stood up. Yes, Your Honor, we do. Ethan held his breath as the judge nodded. The defendant, Ethan Cole, he paused briefly before continuing, is not guilty. The gavel struck down. Relief flooded through Ethan as the weight on his chest lifted. Vaughn and Holloway weren't so lucky. They were handcuffed on the spot, charged with evidence tampering and abuse of power. As Ethan stepped outside the courthouse, the sunlight hit his face. A reporter rushed up. How does it feel to get justice? Ethan let out a small, knowing smile. Justice isn't just about clearing my name. It's about exposing those who abuse their power. He walked away, knowing the fight wasn't over, but at least he had won this battle. Ethan sat in a small cafe on the corner, his hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of espresso. The rich aroma filled the air, but he barely noticed it. The events of the past few weeks still haunted him. He had been cleared of all charges, but the victory wasn't as sweet as he had imagined. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from Pierce. Holloway and Vaughn are set to stand trial next week. The FBI is digging deeper into their operation. Ethan exhaled, staring out the window. He knew this wasn't over. If those two officers had been willing to frame him so easily, there had to be more victims, people who weren't lucky enough to fight back. But the justice system wasn't perfect. Who was to say they wouldn't cut a deal and walk free? A cold gust of wind swept through the cafe as the door swung open, snapping Ethan back to reality. His eyes drifted to the TV mounted near the counter, broadcasting the evening news. His own image flashed across the screen, a clip of him leaving the courthouse, accompanied by the headline, Man framed by corrupt cops walks free. How many more victims are out there? His grip tightened around the cup, anger bubbling up in his chest again. He couldn't stop here. Justice wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about making sure men like Vaughn and Holloway never had the chance to destroy another life. Ethan picked up his phone and dialed Pierce's number. "We need to talk. I want to do more than just watch them go to prison." Lessons from justice and injustice. Ethan's story isn't just about a man being framed. It's a harsh reminder that injustice can happen to anyone. In today's world, the truth isn't always protected, and justice doesn't always come on its own. So, what lessons can we learn from this? 1. Always protect your evidence. If you ever find yourself falsely accused, evidence is your most powerful weapon. Keep records of emails, messages, receipts, or any documents that can prove the truth. 2. Know your rights. No matter where you are, you should understand your legal rights. If confronted by police or anyone questioning you, stay calm and don't provide unnecessary information without legal representation. 3. Don't stay silent in the face of injustice. Ethan didn't just fight for himself, he stood up to protect others. If you witness wrongdoing, speak up or report it to organizations that can help. In today's society, justice doesn't happen on its own, it has to be fought for.